Thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name is Mark Ramseur. I'm the managing principal for Central Texas for Pape-Dawson Engineers. Pape-Dawson Engineers is a consulting engineering, surveying, environmental planning firm throughout the state of Texas. We have offices in the Texas Triangle in San Antonio, Austin, Houston, New Braunfels, Fort Worth, and Dallas. We have a little over 650 people and almost 100 here in Austin. We do quite a bit of land development work throughout the state, both residential and commercial type land development, and we also work for cities, counties, other public entities, including TxDOT. So today I wanted to update everybody on Atlas 14, do a little bit of an overview and an update. Let's see, we'll get this thing started. Be finicky, there we go. So the agenda today is first that overview, then I'll really focus on Central Texas and Austin and what impact and what the city and surrounding areas are doing in response to this new data that came out recently. And that's my area, is Central Texas, so that's where I'll spend the most of the time. I will touch on two other areas outside of Central Texas, both San Antonio and Houston. Both are impacted by this, and I'll give you a little bit of an update. And then really wrap up at the end with a list of questions that I think it would be good for folks that are involved in property and development. Yes? You
have not shared your screen.
Oh, my goodness. Well, how do you're going to have to help me with that.
Down to, there's like a little bar at the
bottom. There it is. Share.
Yep.
Screen one, share. I apologize, everybody. Well, hopefully at least it was just the introduction. Is that working now?
Yes.
Okay. Apologize for that. So you should see a slide on the screen, the agenda. So I'll kind of go back over that. I'll do a quick overview of what Atlas 14 is, then focus on Central Texas and do a little bit on San Antonio and Houston, and then finish with questions that I think you or folks dealing with property and development in these areas that are affected by this new data ought to know, and maybe questions that you ought to ask your teams doing those projects. This thing gets finicky on me every once in a while. So first, Atlas 14. What Atlas 14 is a nationwide study of rainfall intensities. So it was all over the U.S., and the different groups, it was led by NOAA, but a bunch of other entities from the federal government and even state and local government, including TxDOT, were involved in providing data and reviewing the end product. And from this map of the U.S., you can kind of see the different areas that they chopped this up into. And Texas was one of the last areas they did, and they called that Volume 11. So if you hear Atlas 14, Volume 11, Atlas 14 is just the moniker that NOAA has put on it as the overall title of the effort that they did, and Volume 11 references the state of Texas. And so then the impact of it really is that it adds data on rainfall gauges, and there were over 3,900 in Texas that provided data to the study, added data from 1961 to 2017. For as long, I've been doing engineering, land development related engineering for about 31 years. The entire time I've been doing that, we've relied on data that basically stopped in 1960, and there was several different published reports. Most of the work we did had data that stopped in the 60s. And so this now kind of brings up all of the new rainfall information through 2017. This new data set and their findings was released in October of 2018, so a little under a year ago. And then if you look at this map on the right of the screen, you can see what this shows is areas that are green show an increased rainfall from what the prior data showed, and then the areas that are shown in in kind of brown actually show a decrease in rainfall from what the data showed previously. And then the area that's most of the state, which is gray, had no real change. So what this is showing is really the center part of the state from Del Rio through Austin over into Houston and then down, including San Antonio and over in the Corpus Christi area, really were impacted by this data. Most of the rest of the state, including the Dallas-Fort Worth area, is really not impacted. A couple other things to notice, or one other thing to note, is that the Colorado River Basin, which is a big impact on the Austin area, really wasn't impacted. And that's primarily due to the fact that the Colorado River Basin is northeast of Austin and was in the area that's mostly gray here and was not impacted by the study. So a little bit more about what this study did. This is a printout or a slide showing the NOAA's website, and they provided a lot of data from this updated rainfall data set. And we focus on the 100-year, 24-hour rainfall data because that's what is used to develop the FEMA maps that we're all used to working with. That's also the storm event that we design. Kind of the most of our designs are centered around that rainfall event. But this provided a lot of other data and information. So on this website, there's frequencies of storms from a 1-year storm all the way to a 1,000-year storm. And then there are durations of that storm all the way from 5 minutes, and I think it goes to 1 week. So there's a lot of data here. Most people will focus on the 100-year storm event, sometimes the 500-year, sometimes the 25-year, but there's a lot of data and a lot of information that was provided by this study. So this is another map kind of to re-zoom in on the area of the state that's really impacted by this. This is similar to the other map that I showed, just kind of more zoomed in. And what this shows is what each contour on here is a change in rainfall or impact. So if you look over in the Houston area, just east of Houston, what this is showing is that this new data set gives us information that the 100-year rainfall in east of the Houston area is actually 5 inches worse than we thought before. In the Austin area, it's between 2 and 3 inches worse than what we thought before. So that just gives you an idea. If you're working in any of the areas that are kind of shown on this map, then there's probably going to be some sort of impact from this new data set. Now zooming into the city of Austin and really focusing on the city of Austin, the 100-year rainfall we currently design to over a 24-hour period is 10.2 inches. Now with Atlas 14, that's moving up to 13 inches, which is about a 30% increase. And information that the city of Austin has provided to give you an idea of the impact. So existing buildings that were in the 100-year floodplain within the city of Austin, currently we're 4,000 buildings approximately in the floodplain. With this change, it's showing that there's over 7,200 buildings that are in the 100-year floodplain now. So you can kind of start understanding the impact of this. And so what does this mean? It means that more homes and businesses are at risk of flooding than we previously thought. And so then that affects not only existing buildings, but it affects your ability to develop a site, to remodel or redevelop a property. And it's going to also affect flood insurance. Both they anticipate the cost, but also sort of the reach of flood insurance. So more properties are going to be in the floodplain and going to have issues related to flood insurance. Now that flood insurance, from my discussions I've had with brokers, insurance brokers and others, is most places probably won't update the flood insurance until FEMA updates their maps, the firm maps, which will take a few years. I'll talk about that a little bit more in the future. And this also means that we got to restudy all of these floodplains. One of the nice things the city of Austin has done is they've created a website called atxfloodpro.com. And this Flood Pro, if you want to see your property and what the potential impact on your property in Austin, you can go to this atxfloodpro.com, click on the I want to explore Atlas 14 changes. You can enter your property and you'll get a map like this that if your property was in the floodplain, what the impact of that, and you can take a look at that. So it's kind of a nice feature that the city has provided. So then what's the city's response? What's the city's going to do about this? What they've said is there's a 3-step process for them to implement changes to deal with the Atlas 14 new data. The first one is land development code amendments. Then the second one is they're going to really delve into the drainage criteria manual, which is the manual that us engineers really design projects to. It tells us how to what requirements we have to design a storm sewer, to do the water quality ponds, to do the detention ponds. And then the third step will be to update the flood studies and ultimately the FEMA mapping. And so going through each one of those, well, first, I guess, most of the other public entities around Central Texas, including the counties, TxDOT, and the other cities, are kind of following Austin's lead. That was definitely true 6 months ago when I first did a presentation around this. Now, actually, some entities, Leander, Travis County, and others are starting to implement some of these same rules around Central Texas, kind of at the same time as the city of Austin, because the city's taken a little longer than I think people originally thought. So the first step, this land development code updates, really involve a few different things. The main one is that the city is going to update their 100-year floodplain lines. They're going to make those now what is currently shown as the 500 years. So the city has maps that show the 25-year floodplain, the 100-year floodplain, and the 500-year floodplain. Now what they're going to do is basically move each of these floodplains up and out. So the 100-year will become the 500-year. The 25-year will be updated to what's now the 100-year. So they're doing this to limit the risk, but it does impact the amount of property that is impacted by floodplains. They're also creating a redevelopment exception that I'll talk about in a minute. That's a kind of a complicated thing if you're redeveloping property that's in the floodplain in Austin. They're also expanding the Colorado River exception because of what I talked about, that it's really not impacted by this. And they're increasing the freeboard requirements from 1 foot to 2 foot. Freeboard's the amount you have to be above that, the 100-year floodplain. Right now it's a foot. They're increasing that to 2 feet. So one of those items is the redevelopment exception. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but what I would say is if you're dealing with redeveloping a property in the floodplain in Austin, it's best to set a meeting with the city, sit down and go over it, because there's quite a bit of different requirements about freeboard, about safe access requirements if the road is flooded out in front of a property, et cetera. So that's one that's going to be changing, and you need to get with the city if you're involved with that. So originally the city had put out a draft ordinance and has been working through this process with a number of different stakeholders, including RECA and ULI, the Home Builders Association, engineers like myself and others. And they originally thought they were going to implement these new rules back at the end of last year. But as they got into it, they realized there were a bunch of issues that were popping up that they hadn't really anticipated. So they have been working through that. They've got an updated draft that's expected out in the next few weeks, and we'll continue to work through that. But it's taken a little longer for the city to implement this. There were a lot of unintended consequences that we were realizing, things like parkland dedication. If you dedicate parkland for a development, you don't get full credit for it if it's in the floodplain. Well, if we're now expanding floodplains, did that impact the parkland dedication requirements, for instance, was one example. So the city has actually been working with a number of groups to try to minimize impact, if you will, of these new regulations while still providing the kind of oversight and safety that's needed for the higher flood events. So then that's step one. Step two is the drainage criteria manual. This is the one, again, that really gets into the nitty-gritty of the design requirements, detention pond sizes, etc. This is not part of the first revisions to the land development code that the city's working on. It'll be a separate process. It's actually starting now. It's where we'll deal with how to handle phased projects where maybe one phase has already been implemented under the old rules. Now we're going to develop another phase under the new rules. How do we deal with that? Also, how do we deal with draining to existing infrastructure that may not have been designed, but probably wasn't designed for these higher flood events? And then step three is they're going to update the flood maps for FEMA. So for the firm maps, the flood insurance rate maps are what most people get flood insurance around. That will take a couple of years to do. The city actually recently went out and hired a team of consultants that will go through and remap the entire city, and then work with the city, who is the floodplain administrator for FEMA locally, to update the lines for all these maps with the new data. So the timeline for all of this, just to give you an idea, first, what's going on now is really that first step. They've been working for 6 months or more with stakeholders. We expect updated language on the ordinance to come out in the next week or two. Then in September through November, we think, they're going to be going to public hearings to different boards and commissions. And then we expect this step one ordinance that deals with just the floodplain lines and that redevelopment exception to be adopted by City Council at the end of 2019. And then they're starting actually right now to get input and start the process of the drainage criteria manual, which is the step two. I don't know how long that's going to take. They say they want to get that done by the end of the year as well. I kind of doubt that they'll be able to get through and deal with all the issues, but at least that's what they're saying now, is they want to try to get step two or the drainage criteria stuff done in the next several months as well. And then the remapping, or step three, is starting right about now, but will take the next several years, and ultimately the FEMA maps probably won't be updated until about 2022. So again, other entities in Central Texas now are kind of on the same path. Some have been waiting for Austin to go through this, and then they will try to follow suit. But there, as you folks that work in Central Texas probably realize, there are a lot of communities in and around the Austin area, from San Marcos up to Gerald and east and west, both counties and cities, that are going to be impacted by this. And so right now we're seeing a lot of people kind of wait and see what the city does. And then when people I've talked to at those different entities say that they're going to kind of follow suit with Austin, but we'll have to really watch and see that happen. So then that's the Austin update. Now let me shift over to San Antonio a little bit, or down south, I guess, to San Antonio. So San Antonio is a little bit further ahead. They actually adopted new rules and criteria in April of 2019. The way they looked at it is they took the city, the area around the city, and divided it up into 5 different precipitation areas, or different areas that they expected to have. Because if you remember back the map that I showed, those contours, there was not a consistent contour across any given area. Different parts of San Antonio, based on the data, would see higher new rainfalls data versus other parts. And generally, more northern that you go up, San Antonio had a bigger impact, to south had a less of an impact. So you can kind of see these precipitation areas, from 1 to 5, going from 12.87 inches down to 11.15. Now, what this has meant, what this is, the implications, or what this is kind of impacted so far. Overall, from what I hear from the folks down there and talking with my colleagues down in San Antonio, is this process was was pretty smooth. The city did a really good job of getting with the engineers, the developer communities, and others to implement this process, so that's good. There is no grandfathering, though. They decided not to give kind of a amount of time to comply with this. Most areas, I'm not seeing any kind of grandfathering allowed, so if you get you submitted before the date that the adopted new regulations, you were regulated under the old ones. After you're on the new, there's really no grandfathering time frame. They are, though, willing to accept designs and such as a detention pond that was designed under the old data, as long as you can show that you don't impact anybody downstream. This is their, I think, attempt at trying to work with phased projects or projects draining to infrastructure that wasn't designed for these higher flows. If you can show that, yes, that's not designed for these higher flows, but if I do put the flows through that infrastructure, it really may raise the floodplain a little bit, but it doesn't impact anybody, then they'll be just deemed out of compliance, but will be approved. The city has also been very open to reviewing each case kind of on a case-by-case basis. And the city, just like Austin, is updating the FEMA maps. That'll take another couple of years as well to get that data updated. Now, Houston has the largest impact of any area across Texas. If you remember that, there's areas in Houston that had over 5 inches of increase. So from 13 inches to over 18 inches of expected rainfall. So quite a big impact. Plus, as flat as Houston is, that much more water does cause quite a big impact. It's probably not that big of a surprise to anybody, given what we saw with Hurricane Harvey, although that data actually from Hurricane Harvey was not part of this study. It didn't influence the study. So the entire Houston area is updating development codes and dealing with this. That's led by really the 3 main counties around Houston. So Fort Bend County has 1 rainfall intensity across the county. Montgomery County is using the 500-year rainfall until, like Austin kind of is proposing to do, until FEMA maps are updated. Harris County has a little bit more going on and is actually right now in the middle of adopting new rules. We expect to have probably 3 zones of this rainfall intensities, and the impacts we're showing for various storms are from 15% all the way up to 40% increase in rainfall depths from what we're seeing from prior to and post Atlas 14 data. And I think, something we're also seeing is there's a bunch of communities and other counties and stuff around the Houston area that are also in the middle of doing the same thing, just kind of like the Austin area, trying to figure this out. So if you're working in any of these communities around either, I would say, I guess Houston definitely, but San Antonio or Austin, you need to be aware that this might impact your project. And so a few things from my counterpart over in Houston, when talking with him, that came up is that he's seeing that a lot of the receiving streams for projects that we're dealing with can't handle these increased flows. I mean, if you think about the volume of water that we were designing to what we are now designing to, what that's causing is increased detention volume. So your detention pond may not only have to detain what it used to have to detain, it may not only have to detain the increase from pre and post with using Atlas 14 data, but it may have to over detain because the receiving stream can't handle the extra flows. Also, they're seeing an increase in storm sewer on projects kind of throughout. He said that's averaging about a 10% increase in cost for storm sewer on the average project. Also, the Houston area also increased the freeboard. So it was a 1-foot freeboard, now it's a 2-foot freeboard. That increase of a foot may not sound like a lot for a site, but Houston is so flat, and a lot of times in dealing with sites, especially if you're trying to deal with tight single-family development, or you're dealing with a site that's really tight around a building, where you're trying to get the building up to meet this 2-foot freeboard, but also meet all the ADA requirements and grading around buildings or structures. And you think about a real, 45-foot wide lot, then that 2-foot freeboard causes some conflict between needing to increase the building height or the home height while maintaining ADA slopes and all of the other things that go with it. And that's been a real challenge. Also, parts of the Houston area are now requiring mitigation of the 500-year floodplain and not just the 100-year floodplain. So for those of you who maybe have had projects where you try to either modify or reclaim land in the floodplain, and you go through the FEMA process of a clomer or a loamer, now what some of the jurisdictions over there are requiring is that you also study the 500-year floodplain, not just the 100-year, but the 500-year, and you have to actually mitigate any impact to the 500-year floodplain. So this is causing more cost and time and studies for projects over in Houston. Now, that's kind of the update on what's going on. Hopefully, you understand a little bit more about Atlas 14 and maybe what its impact can be on a development or even a raw piece of property. And so what I thought I'd do is run through some questions that I've come across that I think are good for you to ask, know about, and also people have asked me related to developing sites. So first, I think if you're developing in any of these areas that kind of shown in that map that are impacted by Atlas 14, I think I would ask the people you're working with that are either doing due diligence or developing, you're working with your engineers primarily, maybe also your planners, whether they're aware of Atlas 14, make sure they're aware of it and its impacts. Do you have floodplain on your property? That's something we typically look at in general, but now we need to make sure we're also not just looking at the current 100-year, but maybe looking at the 500-year or the Atlas 14 impact on floodplain. Did you have a property that did not have floodplain? Now with Atlas 14, all of a sudden your property has floodplain, and what's the impact of that to development and value? Where is my project draining, and can it take these post-Atlas rainfall events? This is probably one for your engineer, but I think especially if you're doing due diligence for a client or looking at a piece of property, it's good to ask that question early on and make sure you're not going to eat up more of your site to try to over-detain because your outfall can't handle these rainfall events. And then is your project phased? And how does that impact it? Are you buying phase 4 of a project and the detention pond was built in phase 1, but maybe now it can't handle the flows from your site? Definitely phased projects, you have to understand the impact of drainage overall, and then specifically Atlas 14 and how that impacts. How will that 2-foot freeboard? Now, not everybody is going to the higher freeboard, but I think if you have that, if you got a really tight site, how does that impact grading or drainage? Just understand that it may require a little bit more land and setbacks and stuff to meet grading requirements. Should I do an updated flood study? As we get through the process and everybody's really updated all their maps and data, this really won't be as important, but right now we're kind of in between things. We have data on the current or old storms, if you will, and now we have these new storms. Most areas have not been studied with the new data, and so whereas you might have been able to get away without doing a flood study on a project, you may now want one to make sure you're covered. And if you've got a phased project, it's probably a good thing to do an updated flood study on your project. And then if you're doing redevelopment in or around the floodplain, I would meet with the city or other permitting entities that are dealing with that, because I know the city of Austin's redevelopment rules and regulations can get very specific, and they're kind of intricate on what you have to comply with, depending on how much you're redeveloping and whether you're keeping an existing wall and a whole bunch of stuff. So I would just say make sure you're doing your due diligence and meeting with the city before you do anything related to that. And then I think lastly, flood insurance. I've talked to a number of flood insurance people or people around the flood insurance industry, and they really haven't quite figured out what to do with this. Some of them just tell me they'll just wait for the FEMA maps to be updated. Then if all of a sudden your property is in this new floodplain, you're going to have to do a flood insurance. Some of them had suggested maybe getting flood insurance now while your property is not in the floodplain, but it's going to be cheaper to get it now, and hopefully you can keep the additional cost down as moving forward, even if it adds and gets in the floodplain. And then lastly, a comment on this one, I had one potential client who is a banker ask how his portfolio of property would be impacted by Atlas 14. So I think that's another thing we might start seeing is people that have a portfolio of properties around this area that's impacted to really understand what is now the added risk to my portfolio of properties. So hopefully these questions have helped you understand maybe the nuance of Atlas 14 and how it might impact your proposed developments. And then I'm open and available to answer any questions.
Yeah, so we actually have one question. Would you be able to show the slide again for the Houston area?
Yeah. Let me see. Which one? This one? Or the map that shows the rainfall across Texas?
All I got was, can you show the slide again showing the Houston area? So I think.
Let me go back. It's probably talking about the map, I would guess. Let me see here.
Yep, map.
Yeah. And I can zoom in on this area. So that's kind of the impact of the Houston area. So Houston is here. This is showing 4 inches of rain kind of throughout Houston. As you go west toward Austin, it has less from 2 to 3 to 4, and then east of Houston 5 and a little area 5. So hopefully that answers the question. And if you want, if whoever wants to look at this, if you just Google Atlas 14 and say Texas, you'll get to their site. You probably get to a number of articles and stuff and can poke around and find stuff. Also, I will say the city of Austin, if you Google City of Austin Atlas 14, they actually have a very good website that explains a lot of this and has some pretty good links to data and more information about this. Any other questions?
Who has more thorough data when assessing the FEMA determination?
Say that again, I'm sorry.
Who has more thorough data when assessing the FEMA determination?
Let's see. Oh, who has more thorough data when assessing the FEMA determination? I'm not sure I fully understand that. So currently, from FEMA's perspective, FEMA has the current maps that you see when you go to the FEMA website, and those haven't changed. Each area that is a floodplain administrator, and say for Central Texas, that's the City of Austin for the City of Austin, the City of Pflugerville for the City of Pflugerville, will have to go through a process to update the maps, and they submit new maps to FEMA, and FEMA then will update their maps. So if you're trying to get a FEMA determination, if you want to do a lot certificate or something, I think that's still the same process you're doing. You just have to realize that that may change in a couple of years when the maps are updated.
Okay. And then the next question would be, were you suggesting that flood insurance may no longer, I guess, be available for some properties?
No, I don't. I haven't heard that, and I'm not an insurance agent. I'm not an insurance expert. I don't think that's the case. What it is that what the insurance broker that I was on a panel with on a ULI function a while back said was that he thinks most insurance companies are probably going to wait till the FEMA maps are updated to deal with reassessing flood risk. And if you were not in a floodplain and now you're in a floodplain, it's no different than what it is today with you're in a floodplain. You may have to go through, you may not be able to get some types of insurance, but I'm not an expert in that. That's one of the areas where he was suggesting if you think you're on the edge and your property may flop into one, his suggestion was maybe go ahead and get the insurance now. It'll be cheap because you won't be officially in the floodplain, and then to work with your agent on how you handle that once the maps change in the future. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yep, and then the last question we have, the City of Austin or FEMA for 500-year floodplain? I think she meant plain.
Well, the City of Austin does have maps right now that show the 500-year floodplain. Since the City of Austin is the floodplain administrator for that area, there is the City of Austin publishes, if you will, the same FEMA maps that FEMA publishes. The City of Austin also has a floodplain line that they call their fully developed line, which assumes that development upstream doesn't detain. So it's slightly different from what FEMA's is. But to me, probably the easiest place to go if you're in and around the City of Austin is the City of Austin's website. It's much more interactive and easy to get floodplain lines. But basically the 500-year floodplain that the city has that they're now going to convert and make the 100-year is the same 500-year line that FEMA calls out on their maps as the 500-year line. The city has a much more extensive database, if you will, of that 500-year line. Some places FEMA doesn't always have that 500-year available.
Okay, and then I guess the last follow-up question would be who has more specific data if you want to prove your land is not impacted by a new determination of a previously designated 500-year floodplain, FEMA or City of Austin?
Probably be good to look at the specific case, but I would say the easiest way for you to look at whether you think there's an impact or not is probably that ATX Flood Pro. If you're in the Austin area, ATX Flood Pro, and look and see if they're showing the proposed Atlas 14 impacting your property. If you don't, excuse me, if you don't think that's right, you could go do a flood study. It's not clear right now whether or not an independent flood study, though, is going to sway the City of Austin or not. They're basically saying you got to use their 500-year as the 100-year starting when, at, say, the end of the year once they adopt this. And I have not seen anything in the draft ordinance, and don't expect it in the follow-up draft ordinance, that would allow you to sort of get out of it by doing your own flood study. Now, if you've got some real detailed situation and you want to argue that maybe some corner of a building or some piece maybe wasn't studied exactly right, you could get maybe some survey done and looked at, but that's going to be a real case-by-case specific information. But if you're in the city's going to regulate it, and you're going to have to comply with the city.
Also, so another question, if there's no grandfathering in many jurisdictions, do you expect a hit or a reduction on affected property values by the market or tax authorities?
I haven't heard the specific tax authority question. That's kind of an interesting one. I would think, my guess is that there will be an impact, but it'll be to specific properties that are, very specific properties. No one has talked to me about the impact on say, property taxes, but I would think if there is an impact on property values, that could have an adverse impact on property, the overall market. Although, most of these markets are rising in value and cost, if you will, probably more than the areas just around the floodplain. It's probably more of a, in my opinion at least, it's probably more of a specific property or individual problem than it is a market problem.
Okay. Another question. Do you have any insight into how Georgetown, Cedar Park, and Round Rock are handling this new information?
Yeah, pretty much all of them, when I talked to them probably 6 months ago, had said they were kind of following suit with the city of Austin. They had Kevin Shunk, which is the floodplain administrator for the city of Austin, had been leading a group of regional floodplain administrators talking about this. I think I've seen stuff. Leander has recently done some, adopted some new rules. Travis County did. Round Rock's looking at it. As you get up to Georgetown, I think there will be some impact, but let me see if I can go back to this. Oh, here, I guess I can move it. The impact as you get up, here's Austin, Travis County, here's Williamson County. As you get up into Georgetown and north of Austin, the impact really gets less and less. And as you get up past the Williamson County line, it pretty much goes away. So they're not as, don't seem to be at least as urgently worried about it as if you move south and west. I think you see just by the contours kind of the impact.
All right, and then we have a comment on, we are seeing the city of Austin enforcing already. I'm not sure if. Well,
that may be referencing, we do a number of projects in the city of Austin, and we have seen on some of the comments that come back from, on those projects, we have seen a comment basically that says something like, hey, Atlas 14 may impact your site. You're really, and the comment doesn't say this, but you're really not required to do anything right now, but just know that there's a higher impact. What we're doing for most of our projects is we are looking at what we expect the impact of this new Atlas 14 data. I think we as engineers have a moral and a license requirement to at least take a look at it. And then also, if you're doing multi-phase projects, you don't want to design a phase today that will cause you problems in the future. So the city can't really enforce anything right now, but they are throwing it out there as kind of an FYI comment. And it's probably helpful to make sure people are at least thinking through the issue and not just letting it go.
Yep, another question. Are you seeing new engineering approaches or technology solutions in addressing property access through a floodplain?
I guess new would be other than bridging it or something like that. Not really new technologies, I would guess, but we're definitely looking at, you know, what the old floodplain would be versus the new floodplain and how that would impact any kind of bridge or culvert or something that a piece of property that needs to access through the floodplain. I think we're also, a lot of our designs we've done with basically trying to keep the 100-year off the site, or at least the 25-year, and through certain requirements, keep it in the storm sewer and keep it off the site. Mm-hmm. In some cases with these properties that are very impacted, we may have to be a little bit more creative on how we do the drainage. I will say one of the other things that I think would be good is to make sure you have a way for water to get off your site and out of your, I guess, out from impacting you, even if your storm system fails. We typically call that overland flow, and making sure that if the system, a storm system, a pond and other stuff fail, gets clogged or whatever, that we don't flood the buildings on the property. We may flood everything else, but at least at some point, water can get out of the site. I think that's one of the things also to look at when you're thinking about the impacts, because at least if you can get the water off the site without impacting buildings or residences, then even if your system is somewhat under-designed, at least you're not flooding the structure.
Yep. Okay. Another question. Based upon these maps, are you thinking that Buda, Kyle, San Marcos, Hays County in general are likely to be affected worse?
It's kind of hard to tell. If you look at the map, I think you'd say yes, but we really haven't tested it. So the Atlas 14 data is actually now broken up. I think it's something like 3,000 by 3,000 square foot areas. So there's a lot of data, there's a lot of impact. This map just shows one storm event and its overall average impact in the area. But based on that, I would say Hays County appears to be more impacted than Travis County, and then Williamson County is a little less, so in the Austin area. And then from San Antonio, it kind of goes the other way, from New Braunfels down through southern San Antonio.
All right. Do we have any other questions? I don't think so, as of right now.
Okay, well, thank you. I'd be happy to answer questions afterwards if someone wants to shoot me an email. I think the presentation will be available if I understood that correct.
Yeah,
and my contact information is on there.
One more question. What storm event does this map represent?
The 100-year, 24-hour, the one that we kind of typically call the 100-year, the one that FEMA regulates to.
All right, well, thank you very much, Mark.
Sure. Okay, well, thank you.